Hello, and a very happy Independence Day to all of you. It is a couple of days ahead, but there's no harm in coming ahead of that.
Right. Thank you, Akila, for starting. Let me quickly introduce you and also welcome all the viewers to another episode of Dekho Apna Desh webinar series. We've been there with you from the 14th of April, and indeed, now as we inch close to the 15th of August 2020, we are excited because we are very near the 74th Independence Day. So it's our birthday of the nation coming. And clearly, we are very, very excited and happy, therefore, to bring you this whole series of webinars that showcase you not just the places that were of significance as India moved towards its independence, but also the people. But then we realize that in a country like India, while some people may have found their names into the history books, but there were just so many others who have not found their names in the history books, and we must celebrate them because we are where we are because of the work that was done, the sheer passion that everybody had for their motherland. And therefore, as a mark of respect and as a mark of our appreciation and our gratitude to all these not so known people, we have dedicated this episode to all those people, and we hope that we shall be taking into our own spirit, the spirit of all those people, and keep our nation strong and robust the way it is going. So today, joining us, taking forward, starting from a small place, which is an overnight journey from Chennai. So we're going to board the train from Chennai, do a small journey to Shivaganga, and Akila Raman and Nayantara Nair, they have been with us before. They are part of the Storytrails, and Storytrails is going to showcase us, taking us from this place in Tamil Nadu. They're going to take us to Mumbai, they're going to take us to Calcutta, and then they're also going to bring us back to Madurai. So it's going to be a sort of a circuit, I would say. But in doing that, they're going to tell us about all those people that we may not even know of. And while mentioning that, viewers, I would like to tell all of you that as part of remembering the thousands of people who dedicated themselves to the India's freedom struggle, we have been posting the celebrities, I would call them celebrities, on our social media for the last few days. And I would like to just say out a few names: Matangini Hazra, Rani Gendinliu, Surya Sen, Aluri Sitaram Raju, Hiraben Betai, and the list is endless. So do keep visiting the social media handles of Incredible India. Also keep visiting the Incredible India's website. It is also available as an app, and keep celebrating the beautiful, incredible India that we are. I'm going to now pass on the web screen to Akila Raman to take us on the journey from Chennai. Thank you.
Ma'am, my apologies for jumping the gun as usual.
No problem. When you're doing it for the nation, I think it works.
Thank you so much. So she's already introduced us. I'm Akila, and my colleague is Nayantara. Both of us work in Storytrails, and we are a company that designs story-based walking tours, audio tours, local experiences, and learning programs for adults and children alike. Now, our stories are an attempt to showcase the history, the culture, the way of life in India. And these tours right now, they're available in multiple locations across the city, across the country. And the stories, many of them are available online too, through videos and workshops. Our team is a very motley one, I must say that, and it's made up of different people. We have teachers and trainers, we have chartered accountants and theater personalities. So what is it that we all have in common? Well, we all love stories. More importantly, we all love to talk. So having got that out of the way, let me begin by telling you what it is that we are going to do. What stories are we going to share with you today? We're going to be telling you some of the lesser known stories of India's independence struggle. Some of these stories are set during that independence movement time. Others go much further back in time. They examine the struggles, these early struggles that Indians put up against the British. See, it's not like the Indians woke up one fine morning and suddenly decided they wanted the British out. The independence movement was a result of centuries of British presence in India. So today we've got stories of brave journalists, of a cloth that helped bring down an empire, of a valiant queen and her female commanders. And we are also going to tell you stories about how the British themselves laid the foundations for their downfall. So without further ado, let's go straight into our stories. So when we talk about Indian struggles against the British, we usually think of that short period leading right up to 1947. But Indian protest against British authority goes much further back. So many of these early freedom struggle movements may have been unsuccessful, but they did pass on messages. They kept the British on tenterhooks over here. They constantly reminded the British that they were unwelcome in this land. Let's talk now about a successful revolt that went way back to the 1700s. Now, this story is based in a place called Shivaganga, and that's in interior Tamil Nadu. You can see it on your map now. Once, there was a fort that stood very proud over there, but that fort has vanished. In its place stands this little building that you can see on your picture. It stands in the same place where the Shivaganga Fort stood. While we are at all these interesting discussions, let's also talk about woman power at this time. You know that the Indian army has allowed women to become a part of many branches of the army. It's been accepted that women are capable of face-to-face fighting with the enemy. But as you all know, this is not a first in India. There was a women's army in India nearly 250 years ago, and it took part directly in face-to-face combat. In the late 1700s, the big kingdoms of Tamil Nadu started disintegrating and split apart. New kingdoms emerged, ruled by new kings. Two such kingdoms happened, and one was Ramanathapuram, and the other was Shivaganga. Now, the king of Ramanathapuram did not have a son, but he had a daughter named Velu Nachiyar. This very progressive king, I must say, he raised his daughter exactly as he would a prince. He taught her politics, he taught her economy, he taught her martial arts. And in the mid-1700s, there was this young girl, Velu Nachiyar, who could speak English, French, and Urdu. In 1746, Velu Nachiyar was married off. She was married off to the neighboring kingdom, the kingdom of Shivaganga. There was a prince of Shivaganga, and Velu married him. Now, his name was Muthu Vaduganada Periya Udaya Thevar. Okay, that is the name of just one person, but we'll just call them Muthu and Velu to make things easy for all of us. Muthu and Velu had a happy marriage. Very quickly, a baby daughter was born to them, and very lovingly, they named her Vellachi. All was good in Muthu's family until tragedy struck their lives very soon. You see, the Shivaganga kingdom had to wage a war with the neighboring kingdom of Arcot. And the neighboring kingdom of Arcot was supported by the British. You must remember, mid-1700s, the British were a very powerful force in South India, and they had a very strong ally in the Nawab of Arcot. So in 1772, the British army marched against Shivaganga to secure it for the king of Arcot. Muthu realized he really couldn't fight this powerful army, so he sent an emissary to meet up and discuss terms. It seemed like the British did agree, so the Shivaganga army relaxed its guard. And the moment it did that, the British forces swept in and massacred every one of them, including King Muthu. Now, Muthu had two warlords, two very loyal warlords named the Marudu brothers. They quickly rushed to where Velu was camping to protect her and tell her the bad news. Now, Velu did have a choice. She could have surrendered to the British, taken a pension, and lived out the rest of her life comfortably. Can you see her doing that? She was too brave and too feisty a woman to even think of that alternative. Moreover, she was burning with this desire to get her revenge on her husband's death. So she and her daughter and a bunch of loyalists, they all left that place and escaped into further deeper into Tamil Nadu, into what is today called the Dindigul region. Her bodyguard had a female regiment commanded by another lady named Udayal. So Udayal stayed back to kind of stall the Arcot army. The Arcot army came, Udayal faced them, there was a war. Udayal was captured, she was tortured cruelly, but even at the worst, she did not reveal where Velu was hiding. Ultimately, she was beheaded. Velu was devastated. She decided she would raise another army, a woman's army again, and name it after Udayal. And that's how the Udayal Regiment was born. And this Udayal Regiment was commanded by a young girl named Kuili. Kuili was fiercely loyal to Velu, and she was willing to do anything to make sure that Velu lived. By now, the Shivaganga Fort had changed hands. It belonged to the British because the Nawab of Arcot had handed it over as a reward for their help. And to beat the British, the homeless Velu needed a much bigger army. So for 8 years, she walked around South India, trying desperately to gather an army to herself. British spies were just one small step behind her. But Velu herself had a bunch of spies and a bunch of bodyguards, and somehow they kept a tiny step ahead of the British. And she kept wandering and wandering until finally her search ended when she met Hyder Ali, the king of Mysore, a very powerful man and a very bitter enemy of the British. Hyder Ali was terribly impressed by this fierce woman who spoke to him in his language, who spoke to him in Urdu, and convinced him that he ought to help her. He agreed. He sent 5,000 of his strongest men to support her in her battle against the British. So this combined army marched to Shivaganga, and when they got to Shivaganga, they realized that the British, who now owned the place, had fortified it really heavily. There was no way they could get in. And this was when Kuili came up with a very smart idea. She suggested that all her female guerrillas dress up very nicely and prettily, carry large baskets of fruits and flowers, and go into the fort because this was the Navratri season. It was a season of celebration. So they could all go in like as if they were praying to the temple, praying in the temple inside the fort. And once they got in, they could act. So she expected to surprise the British, open the gates, and let in the remaining army, which was waiting for this signal. Everything went according to plan. Kuili and her female guerrillas entered the place. They whipped out their guns from their fruit baskets. They took the British completely by surprise. Kuili did something more. She hunted for the ammunition store. She doused herself in oil. She ignited herself and just walked into the ammunition store. A massive explosion shook Shivaganga. The guerrillas opened the gates. The Liberation Army swept in, and everything went just as planned. Kuili's sacrifice did not go in vain. Velu Nachiyar was crowned monarch. She ruled for the next 10 years. After her, her daughter, Vellachi, took the reins. She too continued to rule, and further, her descendants too, until the merger of the princely states with India in 1947, there was a king or a queen sitting on the throne of Shivaganga. The government of India has honored Velu Nachiyar with a stamp. You can see it on your screens right now. It was issued in 2008. January 3rd is celebrated as her birthday. And even today, Shivaganga and large parts of Tamil Nadu remember this very brave king who united her people and took on the might of the British. And with that, I hand over the baton to Nayanthara.
Thank you so much, Akila, for that really wonderful and I think very exciting story. So to keep in with all these exciting stories, our next story takes us to the place that you're seeing on your screen over here. This is an active business center in Mumbai, Hornaman Circle. See, during their time in India, the British named all the big and important streets and buildings after big and important British people, after Englishmen. So when they left in 1947, Indians decided they were going to rename all of these places after Indian heroes. But Hornaman Circle is an exception. Indians also renamed this, but in memory of an Englishman after the British left India. So who was Mr. Hornaman? What did he have to do with the Indian independence movement? I'm going to tell you that story. So the Indian independence movement was a large and complicated event. It included so many protests across the country. Different people were taking part in it. But very sadly, most of these protests were confined to whatever place they started in. People didn't really know what everyone else was doing across the country. And one of the big reasons for this was that the British had complete control of the press. They decided what was going to be published. And so many of the incidents of protests and dissent that were undertaken by Indians went unreported in newspapers. And English newspapers also, they were very pro-British. So when they reported about something, it was in a very biased way. Enter Benjamin Hornaman. He was an English journalist who lived in Bombay in the early 1900s, and he worked at an English language newspaper called the Bombay Chronicle. Now, the Bombay Chronicle had been started by Sir Feroz Shah Mehta. He was a staunch nationalist, and he even served as the president of the Indian National Congress. So Feroz Shah Mehta felt that all of the English language newspapers in India, none of them were writing about what Indians wanted to hear about. So he started up the Bombay Chronicle, and he invited Benjamin Hornaman to come in as the editor. He couldn't have picked a better editor. See, Benjamin Hornaman was someone that championed the free press. He was a veteran journalist, and most importantly, he was strictly against colonialism. So when he came on board, he started to use the Bombay Chronicle to talk about Indian nationalist causes. At first, the British, they tolerated him. But then Hornaman began to take on big British figures, viceroys and generals, and very soon he made himself quite a few enemies. Then, in 1911, came the massacre at Jalyan in Amritsar. Over 1,000 peaceful protesters were shot in cold blood on the orders of a British commander. The situation got very tense. The British realized there could be a terrible backlash over this. So what is the first thing they did? They clamped down on the press. No reports of this incident were allowed to be published in Punjab. Can you imagine Hornaman allowing this to pass, a champion of the free press like he was? So he decided that he was going to use his own contacts, and he managed to smuggle out one report, a first-hand report of the entire incident. And then he published it. He broke this story that horrified a nation, and it spurred on even more agitation against the British. Hornaman didn't stop there. He published follow-up after follow-up, consistently talking about the British atrocities. And very soon, the Bombay Chronicle grew very, very popular amongst the Indians. That got the British really worried. First, they imprisoned the journalist, the reporter who had actually written that article. And then they decided, they were desperate. So they said, we're going to deport Hornaman. And they sent him all the way back to England. That was a big mistake. See, Hornaman smuggled all of the photographs and the reports about the atrocities by the British. He took them back to England, and he broke the same stories to a horrified British public. Now, what was the result? So what happened? Well, the British were forced to confront some of the harsher realities of colonial rule in India. The Jalyan massacre was brought up at British Parliament and condemned by several big politicians. And as for Hornaman, he continued to write about British cruelties in India from England. And then in about 1926, he managed to find a loophole in his deportation order. He made his way back to India, sat down, and continued his work of writing about the nationalist cause. The red building which you're seeing on your screen over here, This is the office of a newspaper called the Bombay Samachar. It was a newspaper that was published, it is a newspaper that's published in Gujarati, and it is the oldest functioning newspaper in all of Asia. It was first published in 1822, and it continues to be published today under a new name. It's now called the Mumbai Samachar. So it's been running for over 200 years, actually, nearly 200 years. Now, today, this building, it was also the building where the Bombay Chronicle itself was born. So it's the place that Hornaman worked from. Now, Hornaman finally died in 1948, very soon after independence. And that's when this circle, where the Bombay Chronicle had its offices, where Hornaman worked, that circle itself was renamed the Hornaman Circle, and was renamed in honor of an English journalist who showed Indians the importance of the free press. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Akila, who's going to take you to another very interesting story.
Antara. So we know of people, Indians, patriots, who worked for Indian freedom. We know there were some Europeans, English men and women, who were sympathetic to the Indian cause. But did you know that there were also some very British institutions that inspired Indians to struggle for freedom? That too did happen. You see, the British came here in the 1600s, a private limited company. They came here to trade. Within a very short time, they had almost the entire subcontinent under their control. Now, that sounds very impressive, but it posed a lot of problems for the British. The East India Company was a private limited company. They were attempting to run a government. Clearly, they were out of their league over here. They were not prepared. So the initial days must have been spent in a maze of mistakes and guessing, but very quickly they concluded that things would all settle down if they could only get the Indians to adopt to British ways. So they introduced some very British institutions into India. They thought these institutions would make it much easier for them to govern and to control this huge population that they had under their care. What they didn't foresee was that these very institutions would prove to be their undoing in India. Let's talk about 4 such institutions: the judiciary, the railways, the army, and English education. So all those very handsome buildings that you will be seeing on your screen very quickly, they're the high courts of Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. So you'd be able to identify them instantly because they are iconic buildings in more ways than one. And these 3 are very special. Let me tell you why. So you see, when the British first came to India, the law of the land must have left them completely baffled. Each kingdom had its own set of laws. There was very little separation between law and religion. And even courts were not above caste considerations. Can you imagine the British trying to negotiate their way through all this maze of laws? So they just imported their own law into India. They brought in every clause and comma of the British law into India. So as early as the 1860s, they had set up 3 courts, one each in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. And for a long time, these 3 courts functioned as Supreme Courts of these 3 presidencies. They're very special courts because you see, all other high courts in India, they've come up after the constitution was made, after independence was achieved. These 3 courts alone came up because of a royal charter from Queen Victoria herself. So all these 3 courts, very piously in those days, they declared that everyone was equal under the law. But in reality, they were not. An English judge could sit in on any judgment. But if you were an Indian judge, you could not sit and take a call over a European. So even if he'd passed through the same college and gone through the same bar exam in London, he could not try a European. So you can see that this was very, very unfair. It was the British who taught the Indians that everyone was equal under the law. And here they were suddenly turning around and saying that some people are more equal than the rest of them. Enter Lord Ripon, a Governor General in India. He was a liberal. He was there in the 1880s, and he caused a bit of a flutter in the legal system because he wanted to pass a bill which declared that any Indian who had passed the judges' exams in London could sit in judgment over Europeans in India. Can you imagine the British taking that lying down? It caused a riot. The Europeans in India, particularly, I'm guessing, the crooked ones, they must have been horrified at the thought of being judged by an Indian. Eventually, that bill was passed. I must tell you that. It was called the Ilbert Bill. It did get passed, but it had so many conditions that it changed very little in India. What it did do, however, is to disillusion the Indians and make them understand that the British would deliberately twist the law just to suit themselves. So this Ilbert Bill, it actually awakened the Indians to the injustice of it all, and that became one more rallying point for the Indian independence struggle. Think about it. It shouldn't be a surprise, isn't it, that most of our leaders happen to be lawyers? Gandhi, Nehru, Rajaji, Patel, Vivo Chidambaram Pillai. So all this happened in the legal sector. How do the railways figure in this? Have a look at your screen, and what you will see will be the oldest railway station that is still in existence in the entire subcontinent. That is the Purim railway station in Chennai. It was built in 1856. And like I said, the oldest station in existence. The stations in Bombay and Thane were built earlier, but those original structures no longer exist. So why did the British give the railways to India? They had their own axe to grind. They were traders, and they needed to move their goods quickly from point A to point B. More importantly, they'd been through the mutiny. So they realized that if anything happened, they needed to move their soldiers quickly. So it was reasons of trade and security that actually made the British build their railways in India. By the time the 1850s came around, their main ports were all nicely connected to the interiors of the country by a nice, strong railway system. Now, this was a massive experiment, and sometimes massive experiments lead to very unintended consequences. See, all these trains that were running in those days, they had carriages that were reserved exclusively for the Europeans. No Indians were allowed inside them. The rest of the carriages were open to all Indians. All Indians. Every social class and caste bunched up together inside one compartment. You can understand that this was very distressing for the Indians. The British, well, they clearly did not understand the dynamics of the caste and the class system in India. But when the Indians sat there, they started thinking about this in a new light. The idea that all people were equal was a new concept for many Indians. But one ride on a train, and it quickly taught them that. It was inside the railways that the people started thinking of themselves as fellow Indians. And when they got that idea into their head, they thought back to the European sitting in his own exclusive compartment, and they realized he was the alien and not them. So you see, in India, the strange thing is, this idea of the concept of equality under law, it didn't start in a high court and trickle down to the masses. It started in a second-class railway compartment, and it rose as one surge of nationalism. Ironically, the system which the British had built and designed so carefully to protect themselves eventually ended up making them lose it. Back to you, Nayan.
Thanks, Akira. I'm just going to share the screen again. Okay. So let's talk about the biggest institution of British domination, the armed forces. Now, the picture you're seeing on your screen is of the Madras Regiment. Did you know the Madras Regiment, it is the oldest regiment in the British Army, in the Indian Army. Now, how did that happen? I'm going to tell you the story. In its early days, the East India Company they came in as traders, as Akila told you. So they came in with small armies, and these small armies were there to protect their trading posts. And who were they protecting the trading posts from? Not really from Indians as much as from foreign rivals, right? The Dutch, the French, the Portuguese. Then trade itself began to get sort of bigger and larger, and their territories grew with this. So in 1746, right, the French attacked Fort St. George, which was the British fort in Madras, Chennai today. And all of the English soldiers, they had to run away. Some of them managed to escape, and they ran away to a place called Fort St. David, which was in Cuddalore. This was the only other large British settlement in South India at that point. That was when the East India Company decided they needed their own army. So they hired an old British army hand named Major Stringer Lawrence, and they asked him to come down from England and raise an army in India. He traveled all the way. He picked up some volunteers, men who were willing to be trained, and he raised this army. And that was the Madras Regiment. It was the first regiment of what is today the Indian Army. Now, like all the other British institutions we've heard about so far, this one also backfired. So think about it. The British continued to recruit lots of locals, and they were training them, they were arming them. It was a bad idea, arming the Indians. The British took some precautions. They said, okay, we'll make all of these Indian soldiers swear an oath of allegiance, of loyalty to us. And they thought that was enough, but it was not. It didn't work. See, as early as 1806, an Indian garrison in a place called Vellore, which is very close to Chennai, the soldiers of that garrison began to feel like all of these army rules and regulations, they were against the religion that they practiced. So they revolted. They attacked and injured and killed about 200 British officers. The British immediately retaliated. They attacked and killed 600 Indian soldiers. And they thought, again, that was that. This was an isolated discipline issue, so they felt like they'd solved the problem. But of course, again, that wasn't true. Just 50 years later, the Great Indian Revolt of 1857 took place, and you know that story. See, at that time, the British were, the East India Company in India, they had a huge private army. It was twice the size of the British army. And all of these men, most of them were Indians. And they were very unhappy with the English commanders that they served. So rebellion took place. But despite the size of the forces, the rebellion was quickly suppressed and crushed by the British. Now, the mutiny itself fizzled out quite quickly. But the aftermath, it was spectacular. The revolt was so bloody, so violent, that the British government back in England, they were forced to sit up and take notice. They realized this kind of raging discontent amongst the Indians was a very bad sign. It meant that India itself might slip out of British hands. And that's when a royal decree was passed. Literally overnight, the East India Company went from being a private company to being a national company. It was entirely nationalized. The government took control of it, actually. And the crown came to become the ruler of the Indian subcontinent itself. So the 90-year period that followed from 1858 till independence in 1947, that 90-year period is what we call now the British Raj. It was very significant for India itself because that was the first time that India was being ruled as one united land as opposed to being a collection of small little states. Right? And when the crown took possession of all of the East India Company's territories, they also got the army. But instead of disbanding the army or demobilizing it, they decided to keep it because it was too precious an instrument of control. And you couldn't just abandon it like that. And this proved to be very, very true because after this, Indian soldiers, about 2 million Indian soldiers actually took part in the world wars, right? World War I and World War II on behalf of the British. And they served very, very honorably after that. Now, on to the last institution that we're discussing today. Right? Now, the pictures I'm going to show you on screen, just take a little bit of time, just look at them. So these are the universities of Bombay, of Calcutta, Kolkata, and in Madras. Now, they represent yet another British institution that boomeranged on them, English education. The story of English education in British India, it's a story of experimentation. So let's begin with a man named Thomas Babington Macaulay. He was a very high-ranking British official who was visiting India in the 1830s. And he was coming to India at a time when the British were suddenly realizing that, they were just a small handful of men who were trying to rule a subcontinent of millions. It's not an easy thing to do. They realized they really needed help. Right? And the only help they had were the local Indians. But the local Indians, they didn't know anything about Western education. Many of them didn't speak English. So they were no use to the East India Company. And so that's when the British decided they were going to educate the Indians and use them to govern the country, actually. Now, the big question then became, should these Indians be educated in the vernacular language or in English? It was the big raging debate of that time. Now, Lord Macaulay was convinced that English had to be the language of instruction, the medium of instruction. He wrote a very strongly worded letter saying as much, and that letter sounds quite racist to our ears now, but he wrote, and I'm quoting him here, there is no doubt that one shelf of English literature, right, is worth more than all the literature ever produced in India and in Arabia. Now, Macaulay wanted to create a class of people who could act as interpreters between the British and the masses that they were ruling. This set of people, they were going to be Indian by birth, but British by thought, British by education. Right? And Macaulay got his way. That was the beginning of English education in India. It took a little bit of time to get it right, but eventually, as a result, a new generation of Indians began to speak English, and they spoke it quite well. So a significant number of that generation, they joined in as sort of in low-level government jobs. They were the insiders on the governments, in government offices, in banks, in the railways, in the armies, everywhere. And these insiders quickly realized Indians were really being exploited by the British. And that's how the English language itself, it acted as a bridge, it sort of bridged the linguistic barriers in India. So you have a Gujarati speaking Gandhi, he inspired the South Indian Satyamurti. Or you have a Bengali speaking Bose who influenced Prem Seghar in Punjab. English united the anti-English. See, many of the prominent freedom fighters, they spoke English and many of them were trained in England. So Gandhi, Nehru, Bose. So it's very funny, but an education system that the British put in place in India just unexpectedly rebounded on them. And I'm very sure that Macaulay, he wasn't expecting that in the slightest. Now, when we ask the question, what finally prompted the British to leave in 1947? Lots of things, but definitely a combination of all of these institutions backfiring. And the realization that you can't control a vibrant civilization by putting in place these imported systems. Indians had mastered some very British institutions and turned them into potent weapons that they used in their struggle for independence against the British. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Akhil.
Thanks, Nayan. That is quite an interesting story. I mean, I'm sure the British had no inkling what they were letting themselves in for when they brought all this into India. But there are certain things that the Indians themselves developed and used as a weapon against the British. So my next story is connected to this very obscure building in Madurai. It sits quietly forgotten. You can see it is in pretty bad shape. It sits on a very busy street called the Massacre Street. And right here, there was a very dramatic event that unfolded and which gave the Indian independence movement a very iconic image to rally around. So when we talk about images of the Indian independence movement, there are many that come to our mind. But frankly, nothing is more relatable than this image of this very frail looking Mahatma Gandhi with his khadi attire. So why khadi? And what about this coarse cloth really made a statement? In 1931, Mahatma Gandhi went to England to meet King George V at Buckingham Palace. You can see in the picture, he didn't bother to change his clothes. He went in his usual style of dressing, a short dhoti, a shawl around his shoulders as a concession to the cold, chappals on his feet. There were many people in England who were horrified that this man could go in dressed in minimum clothing to meet with the most powerful man in the world, at that time at least. It seems after the meeting, one of the reporters asked him, "Mr. Gandhi, do you think you were wearing enough clothing to go in and meet the king?" And pat came the answer from Gandhi with his usual poker face. He said, "That's okay. He was wearing enough for both of us." Of course, Winston Churchill took it one step further when he called Mahatma Gandhi a half-naked fakir. It was a name that stuck for a long time later. So what was Gandhi doing with these clothes of his? He was making a statement, a very loud statement about economic conditions in India. There are layers and layers within the khadi story. So let's begin at the very beginning. Now, India has been producing fine cotton cloth for hundreds of years. As you all know, it's always been there. Now, archaeologists who have been studying the 4,000-year-old Indus Valley civilization have discovered tools for spinning and weaving, which were used at that time. About 2,500 years ago, when Alexander marched his army into India, his soldiers loved wearing Indian cotton because it kept them so cool. Obviously, when the British got here, they too loved the Indian cotton. You must remember, this was a time when the British was wearing this very itchy wool or scratchy leather right next to their skins. So when they found this cool, soft, absorbent Indian cotton, they found it delightful and they started buying huge quantities of cotton cloth. All this made the British textile makers very nervous. So in 1720, they actually passed a law which said Indian cottons could not come to England. They prohibited the arrival of Indian cotton in England. By the mid-1700s, they'd set up their own textile mills in England, and very quickly they developed machinery, machines which could make the process of producing cotton much faster. So this cotton cloth was a little coarser, it was produced much faster, it was cheaper. It was no match to the Indian handmade cotton cloth, but it began to sell and it sold very, very well. So after that, they decided to start selling that cloth in India. So by the mid 1830s, excuse me, by the 1830s, India found itself in this very unenviable position, you know. It was the largest supplier of raw cotton to the British, and it was the main market for British finished cloth. Farmers were bullied into growing cotton in many parts of India. Spinners, weavers, dyers, they all lost their jobs because all that cotton was being sent off to England to be produced over there. And this huge machinery, this centuries old machinery of Indian weaving and spinning that had been there in India from time immemorial, it was slowly grinding down to a halt. And this was the time when Mahatma Gandhi entered the political scene. They say clothes make the man. In Mahatma Gandhi's case, his most powerful statement was made by how little he wore. When he was studying in England, he used to wear a full suit. Later, he came to India. He didn't shed his suit. He instead topped it with a turban. And that is what he used to wear as he traveled the length and breadth of India looking around and trying to figure out the life of the common man, trying to understand how people lived in India. At one point in 1921, Mahatma Gandhi was on a visit to Madurai in Tamil Nadu. And there, he was shocked by the kind of poverty he saw on the streets of Tamil Nadu. You must remember, Madurai was a famous cotton center, a textile center for the longest time. And now it had become so impoverished that most of the people there, all they had was one length of cotton around their waists and little else. Gandhi was horrified. Literally overnight, he decided he would wear only what the poorest in the nation were wearing. So the next morning, that's on the 22nd of September, 1921, Gandhi emerged from his room in Madurai, clad in the short dhoti, sandals on his feet, and an optional garment which he used to cover his shoulders. And from then on, that became his fashion statement and his identity until his death. So throughout his later period, Gandhi was urging Indians to stop buying articles being made in England and to use things being made only in India. You remember, the British were selling vast quantities of cotton cloth from made in England right here in India. So Gandhi told the Indians to start using the spinning wheel, the charkha, to spin their own yarn and make khadi cloth out of it. So people of all classes took to this idea very enthusiastically. And strangely, that simple wooden charkha, it became a weapon in the hand of the masses, an instrument of defiance against the British. So it was a very simple act, but it was a masterly act because Gandhi took the freedom movement out of the hands of the educated elite and handed it over to the masses. A movement which eventually brought the mighty British Empire to its knees. And from then on, this hand-spun cotton called khadi became the uniform of the freedom fighters and the symbol of a freedom movement. Isn't it amazing how a length of hand-spun cotton can inspire so much? Now, the house where Gandhi adopted this new attire, that's the place. It still stands in Madurai. Today, the ground floor is a khadi craft showroom. There is a small museum on the first floor, and there's a stone tablet in it, marking this very historic moment. Yeah, Dayantara, do you think we should take up questions now?
Yeah, we just thought we've gotten quite a few questions. We'll just take a few. I will just read them out.
I was going to say that I think lots and lots of questions.
Have come up. Yes.
Oh, here's one interesting one, Nayan. Can you tell us more about the Marudu brothers?
Yes.
Aren't they very popular in South India? Oh, yes, indeed. They are very popular in South India. The Marudu brothers went on to do quite a good bit. After that, they also supported another revolutionary named Kattabomman. And today, yes, they are very popular. I mean, there's a big following for the Marudu brothers, and they're considered heroes in many parts of Tamil Nadu, even today.
Just to add on a little bit, Akhila, after they sort of took over, after they helped Kattabomman was eventually executed by the British, actually. And the Marudu brothers gave asylum to Kattabomman's brothers. This, you can imagine, it annoyed the British even further. And finally, the British captured the Marudu brothers and they hung them. So today, yeah, you're right, they're very much adored in many parts of Tamil Nadu. They are worshipped as heroes, and even in some places they have shrines dedicated to them, actually. Let me just see if we can take a few more questions. Yeah. So we just lost you for a second, Akhila. Are you back?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm back.
Okay. All right.
Do we have any?
Someone asks, why are we not studying about the history of Indian soldiers in our schools?
Maybe.
maybe
we should. It is an inspiring.
I would, in fact, also like to take a first question that was put up by so Nayantara, there was a first question put up by someone by the Sariputra Ramteke. In fact, very avid and a very regular viewer of our webinars by asking a question which has nothing to do with today's webinar per se, but saying, what do you mean by freedom struggle? Handful of people got freedom. Well, that is one way to look at it, but I think the progress that we need to make as a people is an unending journey, and all of us are a part of it. In fact, when we bring to you the stories of all the people who were associated with getting freedom from the colonial rule, it certainly, in fact, does not mean at any point that just because the national flag was furled up and that's the end of the story. In fact, it puts a lot of responsibility on all of us who are today the citizens of this great country, that we must continue to do whatever that needs to be done to make this great country even more incredible than what it is. So yes, I totally endorse your sentiment that independence or freedom is not just a moment, it's a moment we celebrate. It's just like the birth of a child. A child comes home, we all celebrate the birth of the child. But after that, all the nurture and the care and the protection and the values, everything that goes into the making of a human being, we know, and I'm sure all of you who've been parents at different points of time, or at least all of us are definitely children to our own parents, we know the amount of effort that goes into nurturing a good human being. That's how a country is. The birth is merely the celebration of the moment. After that, it's for all of us, the children to the motherland, who must contribute and must make this country glorious and must make it as the best country of the world. So I totally thank you for that first question. I'll leave it to you, Nayanthara, to take the other questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a very nice answer, and I think it was put together very beautifully. That is nice.
We had another question, which was, we asked which year was the Madras Regiment formed. It was formed in 1748, actually, officially. Yeah. Someone says, I want to read more about Rani Velu Nachiyar. From where can I get this? Are there any authentic stories or books? I know that there is a very famous movie about the Mardu brothers and also about Nachiyar in Tamil. Any suggestions on any readings?
I think most of the stories that have been written about Velu Nachiyar have been in Tamil rather than in English or any other language which is easily catchable for everybody across the country. But well, Google is always there with a lot of answers and a lot of pictures. So there are questions there. There are answers there.
Answers there as well. We've got Nilay Shetty, who has asked us, who is Lord Macaulay? So
shall I take that?
Yeah, go ahead, Akila, go ahead.
So Lord Macaulay came to India to actually study the law. He came in as to evaluate how to improve the legal system in India. But he was one of those people who like to kind of look at everything and kind of put a finger into every pie. So he studied the situation, and it was his genuine belief that this was the best way forward for a country like India. While he did not really do much to the Indian education system, I must tell you that what he's done to the Indian legal system is amazing, because the Indian Penal Code was written by him. And I think it hasn't been changed from the days he wrote it, if I'm not mistaken. So that was an amazing thing he did.
Someone has also asked, someone asked, do you have any information about the Ice House set up by the British where ice was transported? We do actually. We could tell you a whole story about it, but I'll let Akila just give you a small answer so you won't run out of time. Yeah.
So there was a time, this was before refrigeration, you see, so there was no place where you could get ice in India. Can you imagine these Englishmen? They never toned down their clothing, right? Just because they were taking cotton from here, they were not wearing cotton over here. They were wearing those typical British clothing, shoes, socks, pantaloons, a vest, a shirt, a great coat on top of it. If you were important enough, they'd even have a wig and top hat and gloves on. That was enough material on them to just make them melt into one puddle of fat, but they were not toning that down. So they desperately wanted ice, and ice came from America. A young boy named Frederick Tudor, he decided to experiment with this. So he sent a whole shipload of ice, and you will be surprised to know that 2/3 of his consignment reached intact. Can you imagine the delight the British had that day, buying their ice and enjoying it and eating it up before it all melted and ran away? He was very, very successful. So in order to help the industry of bringing ice prosper, they had to build ice houses. 3 were built. As usual, it was Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. Only one stands, and that's the Madras Ice House. It's no longer called the Ice House for that matter. It's called Vivekananda House, because Vivekananda came and stayed there after his very successful meeting in Chicago when he went to attend the World Religions Meet. When he came back, he stayed here. So today it is Vivekananda House. You can still see it. It's right on the marina. It's beautifully maintained and it's very much there.
Yeah. Thank you, Akila. There's one more.
I will ask you to answer one on Hornaman Circle. There is a question asked, was the Hornaman Circle officially named as the Hornaman Circle? And there's a question on that.
It was renamed Hornaman Circle. Yeah, it was officially renamed Hornaman Circle in honor of him, and it still is. If you visit the garden, there's a plaque actually. We showed a little picture of it. There's even a plaque dedicated to him for everything that he contributed to sort of Indian independence.
Prior to that, it used to be...
There is a request also to do one on Azad Hind Fauj. Yes, I'm sure. And in fact, you know, that brings me again, and I say that in all my webinars, it's so humbling to talk about our incredible country, whether I talk of its geography, history, tangible, intangible, heritage, culture, most of all its people. You know, you can just go on and on every single day of your life, and still we would not be done with the people of this country, with the layers and layers of culture and heritage. If we talk of food of this country, I think we can just spend our lifetime simply eating the food. If we start listening to the different genres of music of this incredible country, endless, endless. But that also therefore brings us to another point which is so amazing about our culture and our country and our subcontinent, viewers, is that we are what we are because of everything that has been a part of our history. There are layers and layers, and I think it also spells for a lot of maturity of the country and of the people of this great subcontinent, that every single time that we have had visitors from wherever that they came, we have had the ability to pick out the best and pick out the things that don't take away from the essence of us being what we are, and yet enriching ourselves and making ourselves an even more enriched culture and heritage. So I just wanted to say that. And I'm also going to say, because every time webinars of these kinds, which are driven by deep passion by our presenters and by everybody watching, I tend to forget where are we going next time. So we are going to take you to Jalyan on the 14th of August at the same time at 11 a.m. And we're going to spend 1 hour there. There is so much history that will be brought to you from there. But at this point, I would again like to bring in both our presenters to carry on and take some more time. We have time and we would like to take a few more questions. Please, Nayantara.
Yes,
Akila.
sure. Go ahead. We're more than happy to. Yeah, so I think there was one question about, hold on, let me just see. A couple of different ones were there. There was a question that said the British people used our people to fight for them and then also to protect them. Why did this happen? I think that's a good question. Would you like to take it, Akila?
Yes. It was an army that the British had created over here. They called it the Sepoy Army. And the Sepoy Army was an Indian army which was fighting for the British. So throughout their stay over here, every time the British East India Company fought with any other king of this country, it was the Sepoy Army that was sent out. But if you thought this was completely a British idea, you must think again, because it was actually the French who came up with this idea. They were the ones who started building the Sepoy Army, and the British just picked it up from them, used it against the French, defeated them and got them out of the country, and then continued using the Sepoy Army to continue keeping the people under control over here. So it's a very strange thing because when finally in the Second World War, when the INA was formed and the Indian National Army was coming to fight the Indians, There was one group of Indians who were fighting on the British side, and there was one group of Indians who were fighting for Indian liberation. All the same people. You see, that was history, and there was little that could be changed about it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I keep going back to the narrative, and again, somebody has asked that how do we, sort of contribute, and how do we make our country greater? From the specific purpose of tourism, since we are bringing to you these webinars from the Ministry of Tourism, I've been saying this to you in every webinar, and I repeat my request. This is your program. It is your country. And we only bring you the platform. We play the role, I would say, just of sutradhars. So therefore, please come forward with your ideas. Please come forward with your thoughts on how you would like to showcase that little story around you, that little place around you that can be of interest to another person. And the ministry is running the incredible India Tourist Facilitator Certification Program. It's an online certification program. You can finish it in about 3 months. You can enroll online. The exams will also be online. And therefore, do join that program and become a certified tourist facilitator and showcase your lovely neighborhood, whatever that you want to showcase. And that would be a great contribution to your country. So that's one way you can do it. Somebody has also asked, what should we do as citizens? Well, I think we are so empowered in this country. We are a strong democracy, and we must use our own responsibilities and duties. If we can continue to do them, I'm sure we will be always a very, very strong country. Again, going back to both of you, the last couple of comments, Akila and Nayanthara, before we wind up for the day.
Yeah. We've gotten, requests for so many different kinds of questions and stories. I'm afraid we don't have all of the time in the world to sort of answer them now. But I think that it points to the fact that there are so many interesting stories that we yet have to share, so many questions to answer. History is a fascinating thing. And like Akila told you, everyone at Storytrails, we love history. So, we hope we get to do more sessions like this as well. But, for all of you that are interested, there is lots of information out there. Do also go and look it up, read and find out. And of course, join us for many more sessions. Akila, anything else to add?
No, it's been a nice session because we spoke of so many different people from different layers of society, from different places coming together, different time periods. And yet it was a wonderful thing, isn't it? From queens to journalists to people who were traveling in a second-class compartment. They all came together, and it culminated in this grand event called Indian Independence in 1947. We are the torchbearers. It's in our hands. We have to take this forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful note to end today's session on. But that still does not end the journey, viewers, of the set that we have crafted for all of you. On 14th August, 11 a.m., do tune in with us when we take you to Amritsar, to Jalyan Vallabhag. It is a moment, it's a very somber moment of our history as we marched ahead to get independent from colonial rule. But we hope that there will be many learnings for all of us as we are going along the journey of the valor and the sheer passion that each of these people had for our motherland. So do join in at 11 a.m. And for today, I want to specially thank both the presenters for bringing some very different perspectives for presentation on this very special day for us. And we hope, viewers, that you shall join in on 14th August. The banners for the webinars that are coming forth are also put up on the Ministry of Tourism's website. They are also put on our social media handles. We do put them up on our Facebook, on Instagram. So if we miss sending you individual mails, you can join in by any of these platforms. Do encourage us and join us in this journey as we take our incredible India forward. तो देखते रहिए अपना सुंदर अतुल्य भारत, बने रहिए, जुड़े रहिए और स्वस्थ रहिए. धन्यवाद, नमस्कार.